In this video, we're going to see how we can add methods to an object in a class that we are defining. So in the previous video, we were looking at a rectangle class, which is a blueprint for objects that look like this. They have two fields, one for the width of the rectangle, one for the height. And we already looked at the constructors of those classes. And we also saw that once we have our bare bones class, we can have a client program that uses that class, that creates some rectangle objects and then does some things with them. But at the moment, the client is doing most of the work itself because the class is so minimal. It doesn't have much functionality, actually has no functionality besides storing data values inside it. So one thing we'd like the rectangle object to be able to do is to grow itself, so that rather than having to explicitly make the changes in the client, we can make a single method call that will change the dimensions for us. And so here's what that might look like in Python. You can see that we're passing in parameters dw and dh for the change in width and change in height. And then those are being used to modify what's in the fields of the called object. Now, we once again have self in the parameter list, and that's how we get access to the internals of the object. And when we make the call, it looks something like this. You can see we have the called object before the dot, so let's assume the name of the variable that we're using for our rectangle is r1, and then we're passing in 50 and 10. 50 and 10 get assigned to the other parameters in the parameter list. So 50 for dw, 10 for dh. Where does self get its value? It comes from r1. So whatever reference is in the variable before the dot is what we assign to self, and then we use that reference to access the object and its internals. In Java, the method looks like this. We again have parameters dw and dh that we're using to modify the fields. Now I want to call your attention to some aspects of the header here. So for one thing, in between public and void, there is no keyword static. And that means that the method is non-static, meaning that it will be inside the object. So it's really important that we omit the keyword static if we want the object to have the method inside it. And then the return type here is void because we're not actually returning a value. We're just making changes to the internals of the object. And so that's why we want to use that return type. And here again, we're using this special this parameter to access the internals. Again, this does not actually appear in the parameter list the way that self does, but it gets its value from the same place, from the called object, whatever comes before the dot. So if I look at the same call here, the 50 and the 10, 50 gets assigned to the dw parameter because it's first in the parameter list, 10 to dh, and then whatever comes before the dot is what gets stored in the parameter this. And you can think of that as a special parameter that is available to all non-static methods, but it's not actually in the parameter list. Another thing that would be useful for our client is the ability to have the rectangle compute its own area. And so we can add an area method to our Python class, and then here's the corresponding area method in Java. Again, it is non-static. The return type is int, because that's what we're returning. And you'll notice the parameters here are empty. There's nothing in the parens because everything the area method needs is inside the called object. So we can just take the width value in the called object, so this.width, multiply it by the height value inside the called object, and return that product. And so now that we have these methods inside our class, we can simplify our client program. Up here where we had to compute the area ourselves, we can now call the area method on R1 to get its area. The return value replaces the method call, and we assign it to the variable area1. We then do the same thing down here. Where we used to compute R2's area, we're going to call R2.area. So we'll get the method inside R2. It will return the area of R2, and we assign that to the variable area2. And then down here, we'll use our grow method in place of these two modifications that we were making. So r1.grow, we pass in the change in the width that we want, the change in the height that we want. And then same thing down here, r2.grow, change in width, change in height. And so this simplifies the client by making the object do work on our behalf.